moving into anthropology all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, we're shifting towards anthropology. As I said at the beginning of the course, this course, some of you, almost half, are taking it as a history course, and more of you are taking it as an anthropology class for various reasons. And in the first two books we've read have been historians, both of which were anthropologically influenced, and you may have noticed that both Restall and Lane cite and quote from anthropologists who have studied in those regions. And Mintz and Bonilla are anthropologists who are historically influenced, perhaps more than other anthropologists. So it works out. But we needed this quote from Amy because it starts with this wonderful line that tells us what anthropology is, especially for those of us who haven't done it before. Anthropology is the study of what makes us human. This is with the aid of studying the human past and how this affects us in the present. Sidney Mintz beautifully describes this in his book, Three Ancient Colonies, Caribbean Themes and Variations. All right, and it tells us a lot about what Mintz was up to and what he was thinking about in terms of history. And I wanted to start with this in part because I wanted to talk about the quiz a little bit. I hope there is. It made me sad to think that there isn't. And if there really isn't anything we can do about it, what should we be doing? Huh? No. If there isn't anything we can do about it, and there's no way to, then there's nothing we can do about its consequences. What should we be doing? Yeah, proactively greedy. We should be more greedy because there's nothing we can do about it. And who cares? Because that's the way life is. Everybody's doing it. You got to get yours while it's happening. And we certainly shouldn't be here. We should be out there getting some, right? Getting out there, getting greedy. We shouldn't be coming to class studying history. Who cares? It's all human greed. It's inevitable anyway. See why I'd be sad? Because I shouldn't be here and you shouldn't be here either. You should be out making some money. So, yes, that's a long way of getting back into what Mintz thinks about history and getting back to near where Amy's quote was, which is about incorporating history into anthropology. History only looks inevitable after the fact, once it's done. Students of history understandably avoid inevitability as an explanation of anything, because the whole point of Restall's book and Lane's book is that things could have been different and might still be different if we collectively think about them and do something. Maybe they won't be, but the whole point is to have some hope about that, to think about it, to try and do it, to study history. Of course, unless I guess maybe you're here because you are greedy and you think this will be the best route to getting more money. So this is a way in our I think hopefully helps us to understand how Mintz was trying to reorient the way that anthropology had been done. Later in this reading, he talks about how much of anthropology, although it was supposed to be the study of all human beings, turned to concentrate on people that were supposedly primitive or indigenous, those kinds of local inhabitants. And so anthropologists got really excited about people that we may have read about in the last couple books, like the Inca or the Aztec or the people who lived in those areas, because they were seen as being kind of pure types of humanity. And Mintz goes off and with a team of field workers in the late 1940s, did his first field work in Puerto Rico, and then in Jamaica, and then in Haiti, and is one of the only field workers in anthropology and only students really to do field work in three islands, which all had different languages, as we'll explore: Spanish and English and French or Haitian Creole, and different varieties of those. So very different colonial patterns. And what he was trying to reorient anthropology around is away from this idea that anthropologists should study in these kinds of romantic, in the sense of like the romance of Indiana Jones type, going off into exotic places, and they should study isolated peoples who would be insulated or pure from other influences. And in that framing of anthropology, basically nobody wanted to study in the Caribbean because it was seen as this place that had been, there were no indigenous or native populations left, and the presence of African, Latin American peoples was basically not something that anthropology did. And so for Mintz, it was very important that if you were going to understand what people were doing in this area, you had to then not consider them just as these kind of eternal types or eternal manifestations of human nature, but as a part of you needed history in order to explain what they were doing. So that's part of what Mintz is trying to do in this book, which turned out to be, he has more famous books. I think his most famous is called Sweetness and Power, but he also wrote a life history of one of called Worker in the Cane, of one of the people he worked with. But this became actually, or turned out to be, his last book before he passed a little bit later, a little bit after this book. There's Marcus's quote. All right, let's see. 3 countries: Jamaica, Haiti, and Puerto Rico. All right, Marcus, what's our first problem here? Countries. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It's a territory. It has never been an independent country. So it can't really be a country, even though it gets to be part of things like you see it almost represented as a country sometimes, but you can go there and just use your U.S. passport, and same with the people who live there. So it's not its own country. What do we want to say instead of countries? Yeah. Yeah, I was hoping you'd say islands, but we don't. Why would we not want to say islands? Oh, well, Jamaica is an island. Puerto Rico is an island. And that's a trick question. There's one of these places is not an island. Haiti is not an island. So, I wanted you to say island, but we'll talk about it. Yes, Amy. Well, yeah, you could try, but then, I don't know. You'd be in trouble with Puerto Rico still. I'm gonna go. I think I would go with places, territories, or colonies. Let's say it's up to you. Let's say it's three places. I don't think we can have a colon there. All right. Three places, Jamaica, Haiti, and Puerto Rico, all have similar histories in terms of colonialism, yet there was a considerable building of ways to live, a building of cultural systems. All right, so what have we been talking about here? Why spend so long on this quote? In part because it gives us a sense of the true complexities of the place that is the Caribbean. So let's see if I can get back to my show. The Caribbean is an enormously varied place. It is divided into what is called the Greater Antilles, which are these bigger islands like Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, which is divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. And we'll be talking mostly about Jamaica and about Haiti and about Puerto Rico. But already there we have some complexities to the Caribbean. We have Jamaica, which these were all at first colonized by Spain, but later, and they have in some cases gone through several different hands and owners over the years. But Jamaica, of course, would become a British colony. Haiti was Saint-Domingue for a long time, would be a French colony. And Puerto Rico, a Spanish colony, which then transfers over into the United States. And then you have the Lesser Antilles. I guess it's kind of sad if you don't want to say that you live in a lesser place, but there are all these little islands down in here, including Trinidad and Tobago, which is one country over two different islands. And Trinidad is a fairly large place here. Trinidad went through being Dutch and French, but eventually became British, which may be a reason why you can be both Trinidadian and Jamaican. I don't know, because there's a sort of common British theme going on there across these islands. Many of the, well, I guess I should also say that a lot of the areas in the what is South America, northern South America, and eastern Central America also in some ways resembles or is like some of the Caribbean islands. And I guess I would say the same about parts of Florida and even New Orleans, which of course was a French colony or settled by the French. And so we'll be learning about a little bit more about places that are still French, like French Guiana, which still is part of France, uses the euro, is not an independent country. Suriname was actually known as Dutch Guyana for a long time, so it was actually a Dutch colony. Guyana was a British colony. It's known as British Guyana. So here often is a somewhat kind of like Belize, which was once known as British Honduras. English is a big language or an official language. Suriname, variations of Dutch, you can believe it, are official. And of course, in the French places, a lot of French is spoken. So you have this extremely and extraordinarily varied history. You also had something that, wait, has anybody else besides Marcus been in the Caribbean? Nobody has gone to South America. And nobody except Marcus has been in the Caribbean. Anybody been to Mexico? Mexico, all right. Yeah. Yes. Oh, and Megan's chiming up there, pretty near the equator and not too many big mountains. So yeah, unlike being in Potosi, it's gonna be super, super hot. Let's see. And the volume's too high with Megan. She'll blast us away if she tells us about Mexico. We'll ask her about that next time. So we have these very varied places. Some of them are not not independent to this day. And also, as Mintz writes, but as we got into a little bit of a conversation between Marcus and Regina, a huge influx of people also come in from Asia, especially South Asia, into Jamaica, into Trinidad and some of the other islands, for various reasons. So there's a huge mixture of populations in some of the islands. And what were those? They don't care about that much about sugarcane, because they got something else. Silver, because they got a big freaking mountain of silver in Potosi. So they don't care about what's going on in the Caribbean. They couldn't find any gold there. They couldn't find any silver there. So they just kind of moved on, in part because there was silver and gold in Mexico and in the Andes, and in part because there were huge populations there. Labor, it was already there, and they wanted to have that big land and big labor, so they weren't worried about that. So then this is what's interesting to me with the Danes, the Dutch, the English, the French, and others. That development was soon to come. We've talked about the Dutch, and they had Suriname and some other islands there. And we're going to be talking about the English, of course. They get Jamaica, eventually Trinidad, British Honduras, British Guyana. The French, we'll of course be talking about them. But what about the Danes? What the heck are the Danes doing there? I actually had to look this up because I didn't know. The Danes. The Danish West Indies. There they were. They got hold of these three little islands, and there they are. The Danish West Indies, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right because they're Danish. Does anybody know what these islands are now? These are now called the U.S. Virgin Islands. You can go there. You don't even need a passport. You can just get down there and just get around and chill out in the Virgin Islands there, the U.S. Virgin Islands. Don't go to the British Virgin Islands, because then there you will need a passport. But if you can get down here, and like Puerto Rico, the people born here are citizens of the United States. The United States bought these in 1917 from the Danes, if you can believe that. So again, this talks about how this is a really interesting area of the world to be in. Why were the Danish interested in getting these islands in the Caribbean? Now you can say it, Regina. Sugar, yeah, because they wanted some sugar. And so beyond talking about these islands because they're super interesting and the histories of them are interesting, let's talk about why we might want to look at these places and what we can learn about our own history from them. Mintz says that the Caribbean is the beginning of European overseas imperial. Before this, we didn't have these kinds of transoceanic empires. The islands of the Caribbean, when soon after Columbus showed up in Hispaniola, and in these places there were not large indigenous populations. They were populated, and there were some interesting stuff going on. But in terms of the numbers and the urban life that places like the Inca and Aztecs had, these were relatively smaller populations, and they were in relatively smaller places, and they suffered a tremendous and pretty immediate demographic decline. As Mintz said, they became colonial early. This was the very first part of it, and they stayed colonial late. So in many cases, they're not even independent countries. Puerto Rico has never been independent, and and some of them, like some of the places that the Dutch have, some of those islands are still part of the Netherlands, the municipalities of the Netherlands. But they were also they became extremely profitable. And that's why you have these various European powers vying, contending, and trying to get a hold of them, because in their day, they were the things that you really wanted. You didn't care so much about wide open spaces, because they gave us what Mintz calls the first commercially marketed soft drugs: tobacco, coffee, chocolate, and especially sugar. And sugar, of course, is used to sweeten coffee, eventually to sweeten the chocolate, and to sweeten tea, which came mostly from South Asia and East Asia, but the sugar used to sweeten it came in general, from the Americas. So as we talked about, the technology and the ideas of the plants of sugarcane, or azúcar, were brought into the Spanish world via the Arabic and the Islamic Empire, where we get azúcar. But it was the Northern Europeans who really started to use this, plant this stuff and work it on a large scale. Slavery and the plantation as the instrument of production. This is hugely important. So what happens in the Caribbean is you have what Mintz calls the slavery-sugar-plantation complex. This is enormously important to both the history of the Caribbean, but also to how our world turned out today. As Mintz says, this would be a massive operation, millions of people. In this case, it truly is millions of Africans. Nearly 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. And it's many of whom did not even make it. It also was one of the key insights that Mintz gives us, is how the plantations were run very much like factories, or very industrial. And so a lot of people have tried to claim that because there were enslaved people working there, it wasn't part of industrial capitalism. Mintz has tried to demonstrate that what it took to harvest the sugar cane, to strike it, and to make it into something that could then be transported and sold, required industrial skills, organization, and an operation. And that in some cases, later industries would be based on what the kinds of things that the Europeans pioneered in the Americas in the plantations. And that the people who worked there, even though they were often enslaved, would in some ways could be considered modern individuals before other people were using these terms. And what I think he means there is that the people who were working in these places, their identities came not from their older identities of kinship, family, and geographical location, but because of their work, because of the things that they were doing. What this would do would be to almost completely alter European and basically global food habits, in the sense that many of our calories would start to come from sugar and from being able to use commercially available soft drugs, tobacco, coffee, tea, and that this would be the fuel for later industrialization, the working classes. Because in the old days of Europe, as you were going along in your work day, you're doing your farm labor, you might have a little bit of beer all throughout the day, a little bit at breakfast, a little bit at lunch, a little bit at dinner, a little bit of wine all throughout the day. But the industrial factory was not very good to have beer and wine, so it changed into the coffee break, and then you could do more work with your new hit of sugar. The result, though, although these colonies were extremely profitable during the first phases of colonization, as they were exhausted and as production shifted to other places, as we talked about what happened in Potosi as well, it left them as not having very many resources, and often in a kind of colonial subordinate situation. So we'll be, of course, reading much more about this, the slavery-sugar-plantation complex, but this is extremely important to note as we go into our other stuff. A complex aspect of the Caribbean plantation system, which flourished at different times, both in large islands such as Cuba and small ones such as Martinique, was how it affected other parts of the local economy. So this is an interesting part of things, is that not only are there different histories of enslavement and different populations that were brought there and different things in different periods of time, but also how large the island was. If there were small farms on the outside, if there were places that you could get to that were beyond the plantation system, how much hinterland there was, would be a huge part of how things would develop. And we'll be reading about that in Jamaica. Interesting situation where most of the indigenous or native population is decimated. There's new people, new Europeans coming in, but you have in many of these places, not all, Puerto Rico not much, but in many of them a large number of enslaved Africans coming into these places to make up a new culture. And so for me, I think as we later find out, this was Mintz's last book, and for me, to me, it seems like the last offense of his way of doing anthropology, which one was to emphasize how much you needed to talk to people and to get what we call ethnography, to the writing about people by talking to them. And that in some ways, what it meant to be human was being able to put together creatively different resources against the adversity and against the odds. And for Mintz, he would say that this was really one of humanity's greatest and most incredible achievements, is that people from Africa were dragged into these places, uprooted from their home, faced an often deadly voyage, and in a completely new environment, forged creative and interesting cultures out of it. It's pretty astounding if you think about it. But it also led to, as Mintz was studying with the people that he considered to be his friends, and he knew how smart they were and how talented they were and how hardworking they were, how was it that despite all, that even with all these talents and the things that they had accomplished and done, how could they still be so poor or disadvantaged? So this was some of the, I think, the big themes that Mintz was working on, both in terms of trying to understand the individual and little tiny particularities of each of these incredible islands and their histories, but also to understand these larger big themes about how we make culture and society. Our next quote is from Megan. Megan, you need to italicize that title, take away those quote marks, and then there's a big long quote that you use. You have to shorten that up. But the important part about this is that on page 39, where Megan is here, there's something that I think down at the bottom, I mean, he's talking about how everybody there had to adjust to a new setting. But if you look at the bottom of the page, if this was the case for the Europeans, it was equally so for the enslaved. The success of the slaves in building their own new cultures, in spite of the everyday conditions they faced, was a demonstration of their humanity. I have noted my belief that their cultural achievement may be unique in human history. Going over into page 40. So that in some ways it was a unique achievement to, in this new world, be able to create new cultures. So the lectures that Mintz was giving here, these were lectures that were then turned into this book. They are in honor of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most famous Black intellectuals in the United States. And at the very beginning, Mintz quotes from Du Bois from 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, which in Du Bois said, the problem of the 20th century, he meant from 1900 to 2000, is the problem of the color line. And then Mintz says something that I think is probably, at least as of now, still true. It is early enough in the 21st century for us to wonder whether this century will be genuinely different. He goes on to say that when Du Bois went and lived in Jamaica, Du Bois said that he was able to live beyond the color line. And so in the next chapter for Thursday, we'll be reading about Jamaica. And I guess what I want to say is to think about the idea of race and how it is differently constructed in the United States versus in Jamaica, and why Du Bois felt that he was able to live beyond the color line when he lived in Jamaica. How was that different from being Black in the United States? So we'll be reading through each of these chapters. We'll do Jamaica for Thursday. We'll do Haiti and Puerto Rico for Friday. And then for